The black teen who saved a billionaire's pregnant wife on a flight, and what he asked after made the man cry. At over 35,000 feet above the vast Atlantic Ocean, the night stretched endlessly beyond the oval window. Inside the cabin, the only light came from the soft glow of the overhead reading lamps. 17-year-old Elijah Williams sat quietly in his economy seat, aware of two things. The woman 3 rows ahead of him was dangerously close to death, and everyone on board was looking in the wrong direction for help. A sudden scream shattered the fragile silence of the red-eye flight. "Please, someone help her." The cry sliced through the calm of first class, triggering immediate action from the flight attendants, their faces stiff behind trained professionalism, but their eyes betrayed a growing fear. A silver-mailed man in a pristine suit clutched his wife in panic. She was elegant, with a prominently swollen belly signaling the final weeks of pregnancy. Her lips had turned a bluish hue, and her hand gripped his arm like it was the last tether to life. The man, Richard Harrington, cried out in desperation, "I'm just a financial consultant. I'm not a doctor." His hands trembled as he held onto his wife's cold fingers, the gleam of his wedding band flickering with every hopeless tremor. In the back of the plane, Elijah sat frozen. He knew exactly what was happening, the signs, bluish lips, shallow breaths, the fading eyes. He'd seen them before. But the eyes of the flight crew, scanning for a doctor, never once landed on him. A black teenager in a faded hoodie and worn jeans. Who would think someone like him knew how to save a life? He swallowed hard, heart pounding, body tense, caught between two choices: step forward or stay silent. In less than 30 minutes, everything changed. Not only for those aboard that flight, but especially for Richard Harrington. A man who once believed he could buy anything now faced a request from the boy who had just saved his wife and unborn child. A request that had nothing to do with money and no strings attached. But it was so profound that it made him weep and collapse in the middle of the airport, confronted with a truth about himself he had never dared to face. The biases he believed he didn't have. This wasn't just a touching story, it was a wake-up call, a collision of two worlds that were never supposed to intersect. Catherine Harrington's glossy blonde hair had graced countless photos at elite charity galas, but today her usual elegance gave way to tight lines of worry on her forehead, unmistakable traces of anxiety. "I'm fine, Richard," Catherine whispered, resting one hand gently on her round belly, a clear sign of the motherhood to come. "Dr. Winters said flying during the second trimester is still safe. The conference in London is important. I want to be there when you receive your award." Richard nodded, but his eyes showed unease. After 3 miscarriages and a long, painful journey through fertility treatments, the baby growing inside Catherine was the last miracle they still believed in. 28 weeks along. Long enough to give them hope, but still short enough to fuel their fear. "I booked first class. We've got a private car waiting in London. A doctor on standby around the clock," he repeated, like a mantra meant more to calm himself than his wife. "And I already told the crew about your condition." Catherine chuckled softly, running her hand along his. "You're always so overly prepared. That's probably why they're giving you the Humanitarian of the Year award, right?" As the driver loaded their matching Toomey suitcases onto a luggage cart, neither of them noticed the beat-up yellow cab pulling in a few cars behind. Its back door creaked open, and a skinny teenager stepped out, backpack frayed at the seams, counting loose change to pay the fare. Elijah Williams winced as he handed over nearly all the money left in his wallet. The trip from his grandmother's run-down apartment in Harlem to the airport had cost more than he expected. He carefully folded his last $20.00 bill and tucked it away. His emergency money, which Grandma insisted he carry. "You're going to make them stare in disbelief," Grandma Beatrice had said that morning, her frail hands marked with age spots, trembling slightly as she straightened his collar. At 73, she was still the strongest person Elijah had ever known. Even now, living with an oxygen tank and relying on medications that ate up most of her social security. But to her, Elijah was always special, and today was the day he would prove it to the world. He hadn't told her that the Young Medical Achievers International program only offered a partial scholarship. Every other cost, airfare, lodging, food, had to come from Elijah himself. Birthday savings, after-school jobs, and a small portion of the life insurance his mother left behind after losing her battle with breast cancer 3 years ago. All of it went into this one trip. This wasn't just a learning opportunity. It was his only chance to change their future. Not just his, but the future of the ailing grandmother barely getting by in a one-room apartment with a broken heater and an elevator that never worked. In the crowded terminal of the airport, Elijah clutched the boarding pass he had printed the night before. His hands trembled slightly as he double-checked the departure gate. His heart pounded, part excitement, part fear. He had never left New York, never flown on a plane. But in just a few hours, Elijah would cross the ocean to attend a prestigious program that only accepted 50 students from around the world each year. The letter of recommendation from his AP biology teacher had read, "Elijah Williams is an exceptional talent, someone with a biological intuition no textbook could ever teach." What the letter didn't mention, and could never fully capture, was that Elijah's medical knowledge hadn't come from a lab, but from the harsh realities of life. Since the age of 14, he'd been the one to pick up his grandmother's prescriptions, read every warning label, and search online for side effects, because one mistake could cost too much. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease had left Grandma Beatrice weaker by the day. Her nightly coughing fits were so violent they seemed to tear her lungs apart. Elijah learned to count her breaths, trying to sense when heart failure might strike. He taught himself to use a stethoscope, monitor blood pressure, track heart rate with a stopwatch, and gradually he memorized the list of medications from diuretics to bronchodilators, as if it were a subject essential to survival. While many kids his age were playing video games and watching cartoons, Elijah was staying up through the night watching over his grandmother's sleep, Googling how to use a nebulizer, and learning how to stay calm in emergencies. As he weaved through the bustling international terminal, Elijah felt the weight of how his skin color and plain clothes set him apart. No one had to say anything. Their eyes did the talking. People subtly moved aside when he walked by, avoiding contact like he carried some invisible threat. A security guard glanced at him with deliberate nonchalance. A mother pulled her child closer, her look heavy with suspicion. Elijah was no stranger to this, but today it cut deeper. Today he thought he'd be recognized for his intelligence, his determination. But just stepping into the airport reminded him it wouldn't be that easy. Lost in thought, he nearly walked into a luggage cart. The airport worker shot him a look before pushing it along. Elijah stepped back, and that's when he saw them again. The couple he'd glimpsed at the curb earlier. The powerful-looking man was guiding his pregnant wife, her designer dress barely concealing her rounded belly, toward the first-class check-in counter. Instantly the staff straightened up, their trained smiles appearing like clockwork. Elijah watched for a few seconds, then turned away. He joined the economy line. 3 times longer, louder, and messier, but it was where he belonged, at least for now. He didn't yet know that in just a few hours, fate would pull him out of that world and into Richard Harrington's, not through money, but through heart. Across the lounge, in the premium waiting area, Richard scrolled through emails on his phone while Catherine lounged in a leather chair, flipping through a pregnancy magazine. The space was quietly luxurious. Soft lighting, footsteps muffled by thick carpeting. Catherine leaned back and winced slightly. "Must be Braxton Hicks again," she said, rubbing her side, her voice low but tinged with fatigue. "They've been showing up more often lately." Richard immediately looked up. "Want me to call Dr. Winters?" "I'm okay," she smiled, the reassuring look he knew so well shining in her eyes. "I remember the instructor from our prenatal class said it's just my body practicing." Richard nodded slowly, though his gaze never left her. Catherine always tried to appear strong, but he knew the truth. Every step she took now was a gamble with fate. His phone lit up again, another email from the investment team about the Rwanda project. It was the largest healthcare initiative Harrington Financial had ever funded, a hospital being built in the heart of Africa. At first, it had been little more than a tax strategy proposed by his finance team. But Catherine had changed everything. Once she got involved, it stopped being numbers on paper. She organized fundraisers, visited orphanages to assess real needs, and recruited volunteer doctors. Maybe it was her way of filling the silence they had lived with for years. The quiet absence of a child they longed for. A lounge attendant approached with a polite bow. "Mr. Harrington, we'll begin boarding in a few minutes. May I escort you and your wife to the gate?" Richard stood, gently helping Catherine up, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And right now she truly was. Back in economy, Elijah stood in a long line, flipping through handwritten flashcards. Disease names, mechanisms, clinical symptoms. Each card was another brick in the bridge he was building out of Harlem, a place where elevators never worked, and dreams often faded behind unpaid bills. The worn edges of his flashcards were proof of the hundreds of hours he'd spent studying under the dim desk lamp in their small apartment, where knowledge was the only thing brighter than reality. He flipped one card and whispered to himself, "Pulmonary embolism, symptoms, shortness of breath, chest pain, rapid irregular heartbeat." No one on the flight knew that in just a few hours, that exact phrase would become the centerpiece of a life-or-death race at over 33,000 feet. Boarding was a clear display of the invisible line between two worlds. Richard and Catherine Harrington were escorted through the priority lane, welcomed with polished smiles and wishes for a pleasant flight. They were seated in first class, each with a spacious private pod, fully reclining seats, and glasses of sparkling champagne in Richard's hand, while Catherine chose sparkling water, thinking of the baby's safety. At the same time, Elijah quietly walked down the narrow aisle of the economy cabin, his heavy backpack dragging his shoulders down. He found his seat, a middle one already flanked by two other passengers. On one side, a large businessman had claimed both armrests, his face unapologetically territorial. On the other, an elderly woman had dozed off by the window, her head resting gently against the glass. The plane left the runway, ascending into the darkening sky. No one in the cabin could have imagined that just a few hours later, the sturdy line separating class, prejudice, and power would be shattered, when the fragility of life would force everyone to see each other simply as fellow human beings, not titles or bank accounts. About 4 hours into the flight, the view outside the window was pure black. Inside the cabin, the lights had been dimmed to their lowest setting. Most passengers had drifted off into that half-conscious state unique to long-haul flights. That strange limbo between space and time, where everything floats between the past and the future. Elijah was still awake, his eyes bright even as the cabin fell into silence. He waited until the businessman beside him began to snore in steady rhythm before slipping out of his seat, careful not to disturb anyone. He walked to the back of the plane near the galley to stretch his legs and review his study materials. Under the yellowish glow of the galley light, he pulled out his flashcards once again. Even though he'd reviewed them hundreds of times, he continued to test himself. Respiratory rate over 20 breaths per minute may be an early sign of respiratory distress, he read silently, lips moving out of habit. "You should try to catch a little rest, sweetheart." A warm, low female voice came from behind the beverage cart. It was an older flight attendant. Her name tag read Gloria. Restocking the bottles, the wrinkles around her eyes were deep but kind, shaped by years of life rather than bitterness. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied politely, his voice edged with fatigue. "Nervous? A little," Elijah admitted, eyes dropping to the floor. "It's my first time flying." Gloria let out a soft chuckle. "And you picked a transatlantic flight for your first? That's quite the leap. Where are you headed? Anyone meeting you on the other end?" "No one's picking me up. I'm going to an interview for a medical program for high school students, Elijah said, voice quiet but clear. They only accept 50 students worldwide. Gloria's expression shifted. A flash of surprise, then something warm, respectful. It was the kind of look Elijah didn't often get from strangers, and almost never without a hint of doubt. That's impressive. You know, my grandson's about your age, and all he cares about is video games. A soft ding interrupted them. The call light from first class had just lit up. Gloria glanced at the display and sighed, probably asking for more champagne, she murmured. Then, turning to Elijah, her voice softened. Listen, don't let anyone judge you just because it's your first time. I believe you're going to do something amazing, Elijah nodded, offering a small smile. Inside him, that belief, however new, sparked like a quiet light in the dim airplane cabin. He didn't know that in less than an hour, those same bright eyes of his would make the entire plane look at him in a completely different way. Those folks up front, Gloria added as she pushed her cart forward, giving Elijah a knowing smile. They're not sleeping as soundly as you think. Elijah nodded, offering a polite farewell, then returned to his seat, carefully squeezing between his still sleeping neighbors. He buckled in quietly, but his mind drifted to the first-class cabin, to that elegant couple he'd seen at the airport entrance, now resting in fully reclining seats, surrounded by soft golden light, champagne in hand and peace that seemed to belong to another world. Elijah wondered, what do people like them even worry about? Surely not whether their last $20 bill would stretch for 2 more days of meals before the scholarship stipend kicked in. Not how to split coins to avoid going hungry in a city as expensive as London. In first class, Catherine Harrington shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position even though her seat was nearly flat. The luxurious, quiet surroundings did little to ease the dull ache creeping along her lower back. She had felt occasional dizziness throughout the day, blamed it on pregnancy, on hormonal changes the doctors said were normal. But now, as she placed a hand on her chest, she sensed a strange pressure, like something was pressing outward from deep inside. "Richard," she whispered so softly it was almost as if she didn't want anyone, especially her husband, to hear. Over the past months, Richard had already been so tense, so worried. Catherine knew if she showed any sign of distress, his fear would multiply instantly. But Richard, long accustomed to running companies on minimal sleep, responded almost immediately. Years of business had trained him to snap out of light sleep with full alertness. "What is it? Are you okay?" "I think it's nothing," Catherine forced a smile, "just a little short of breath." But Richard wasn't fooled. He pressed the call button for the flight attendants, trying to keep his voice calm, even as worry began to flicker in his eyes. "Let me ask them to bring you some water. Dr. Winters said you need to stay hydrated, remember?" Gloria appeared quickly, her face still composed with professional calm, but her eyes showed a flicker of concern as she noticed the unusual pallor on Catherine's face. "Mrs. Harrington, are you feeling okay?" she asked, her hand instinctively reaching for Catherine's wrist to check her pulse. "I'm fine," Catherine tried to answer, but a sharp pain cut her off mid-sentence. Her hand clutched at her chest, and her face contorted in distress. I can't breathe." "How many weeks along is she?" Gloria asked quickly, her tone turning serious. 28 weeks, Richard replied, his hand never leaving his wife's. "Is something wrong? Should we be worried?" Gloria gave a small nod, keeping her voice calm, though urgency had clearly taken hold of her eyes. "I'll get the medical kit and check if there's a doctor on board. Please keep her calm and help her take slow, deep breaths." She turned and moved briskly down the aisle. Her steps were light but urgent. As she made her way through the plane, she picked up the PA handset and broadcasted a short but pressing announcement, requesting medical assistance. Meanwhile, Catherine's condition was visibly deteriorating. She was breaking into a cold sweat despite the cabin's stable temperature. Her breaths grew shallow and rapid, shaky and insufficient. "Richard," she whispered, real fear now glimmering in her eyes. "Something's wrong." "I think it's the baby." Richard gripped her hand, the composure he was known for dissolving completely. Emotions surged in his chest, and he shouted, his voice booming through the cabin. "Please, someone help my wife. She can't breathe." The cry shattered the plane's silence. Passengers stirred awake, disoriented and concerned. Reading lights flicked on across the rows as all eyes turned toward first class, where a woman was fighting for each breath, while the life growing inside her slowly faded with her. Elijah jolted upright, his heart pounding against his ribs. Not from a dream, but from the rush of anxious whispers and hurried footsteps weaving through the rows. Snippets of conversation reached his ears. "Pregnant woman. Can't breathe." In first class, a flight attendant rushed past his seat, holding a bright red emergency kit, the kind reserved for the most critical cases. She raised her voice, scanning the cabin. "Is there a doctor on board?" Elijah froze. The words hit him like lightning. Shortness of breath, pregnant, chest pain. They weren't just textbook terms. He had seen it before. Last year, his grandmother had nearly died from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that blocked her lung and cut off her oxygen. The doctor had said if they hadn't reached the hospital in time, she wouldn't have made it through the night. And he remembered clearly, pregnancy drastically increased the risk of embolisms due to changes in blood circulation. He'd read that in medical books. During countless sleepless nights studying beside his grandmother's bed, Elijah's hand gripped the seat back, a storm raging inside him. He wasn't a doctor, just a high school student. Who would believe him? What if he was wrong? But then the attendant's voice rang out again, sharper now, almost desperate. And it hit his chest like a command. He stood up, raising his hand. "I'm not a doctor," his voice shook slightly, but it was steady and loud. "But I think I know what's going on." The flight attendant glanced at him quickly, then shook her head. "We need a licensed professional. Please sit down, this is serious." "It could be a pulmonary embolism," Elijah said louder. "Pregnancy increases the risk 5-fold. She froze. Elijah took a step forward. "Did she say she had to pause mid-sentence? Is one of her legs swollen?" His voice now carried the rhythm of someone who had seen a crisis before, not just studied it on paper. How do you know those symptoms?" the attendant asked, hesitating. "My grandma had one last year. I was her main caregiver. She had COPD and heart failure. I managed her meds, helped with her oxygen, called the ambulance in time. If this is PE, she needs oxygen now, and possibly anticoagulants. Does the kit have aspirin?" The attendant, it was Gloria, stood frozen for a moment as passengers whispered anxiously around them. Her eyes locked on Elijah, caught in the balance between protocol and gut instinct. Then a voice from the front rang out again, louder, more urgent. "Please help my wife." And in that single heartbeat the decision was made. Gloria nodded and turned. "Follow me, but if you're wrong, I hope I am," Elijah replied softly. But his eyes didn't waver. He knew this was no moment for error. But silence would be the real unforgivable mistake. He moved quickly toward first class, fully aware of the skeptical stares following him, curious, wary, even mocking eyes. But he didn't care anymore, because at that moment, the only thing that mattered was a life, or maybe two, hanging on the edge of survival. The scene that greeted him as he arrived hit him like a blow to the chest. Catherine Harrington was lying on her side in the spacious cabin, her face as pale as paper. Every breath looked like a battle, her eyes wide with panic. Richard stood over her, the calm exterior of a billionaire completely gone. He was slumped beside her, hands trembling, gripping nothing but raw fear. Gloria was trying to fit an oxygen mask onto Catherine's face, but she kept shaking her head, gasping, like air simply couldn't find its way into her lungs. When Elijah stepped in, Richard turned abruptly. In his eyes were two colliding forces, doubt and desperation. And in that instant, Elijah understood, not intellectually but instinctively, that there was no time left to hesitate. "Who is this? Where's the doctor?" Richard nearly shouted when he saw a black teenager walk into first class instead of the white coat he'd been hoping for. "There's no doctor on this flight, sir," Gloria said, urgent but professional. "He says he might know what's happening." Richard squinted, the sharp gaze of a man who had judged 1,000 business deals with a single handshake. He looked Elijah up and down, his age, his plain clothes, his skin. Richard had made a career out of reading people in seconds. And nothing he saw fit the image of someone he'd trust with his wife's life. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have let Elijah pour his coffee, let alone save a life. But these weren't normal circumstances. "What's wrong with my wife?" he demanded, his voice slicing through the air. Somewhere between command and plea, Elijah swallowed hard, pushing his self-doubt deep down. "Sir, I think it could be a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lung. The symptoms line up, and pregnancy significantly increases the risk, especially on long flights." "And you know this?" "How?" Richard asked, voice sharp with suspicion. "I take care of my grandmother," Elijah replied, steady. "She has similar conditions. I started studying medicine when I was 12. Elijah stepped closer to Catherine, softening his voice. "Ma'am, do you feel pain or swelling in one leg? Maybe it started before the flight?" Catherine gave a faint nod, her lips trembling as she pointed toward her left calf. "Since yesterday. I thought it was just pregnancy swelling." Elijah turned to Gloria, his voice now taking on the cadence of someone in control. "We need to elevate her legs, keep the oxygen flowing, and if the kid has aspirin, she should take one immediately. It can help thin the blood and slow the clot's growth. Also, check for anticoagulant injections. Heparin. Some advanced kits included." Gloria exchanged a glance with another attendant, then nodded firmly. "I'll check. Emily, notify the captain. We may need to make an emergency landing." Richard stood frozen, silent, as the usual hierarchy and sense of control he relied on unraveled with every calm, precise word from this boy. He watched Elijah kneel beside Catherine, gently lifting her leg onto a folded blanket while continuing to explain. "The clot probably formed in her leg. If undetected, it can travel to the lungs. Aspirin won't cure it, but it can buy us time until we get her to a hospital." Richard's breathing was ragged. "How'd you know all this?" His voice was no longer angry, but full of disbelief and something else, something close to respect. Elijah looked up, locking eyes with him. "Because I have to. I'm the only one my grandma has." Then he turned back to Catherine, his tone gentle. "Mrs. Harrington, the oxygen is going to help. Try to breathe deep, slow, okay?" In that moment, high above the murky Atlantic, inside a plane so still it seemed suspended in time, everything paused. A man who once gave orders to stock markets now stood watching a teenager he wouldn't have noticed on the street, saving his wife. No one said a word, but something shifted, quietly, profoundly, in the way they looked at each other. There were no declarations, but in that cold, private cabin, something had broken open. The invisible walls of class, of race, of bias began to crack. In that artificial space where people were divided by boarding passes and seat rows, the boundaries were blurred by the only thing that still mattered: life. The captain's voice came through the PA system, firm but composed. "We will be making an emergency landing in Iceland, the nearest destination with appropriate medical facility." The plane gently tilted northward as Catherine's breathing began to stabilize with oxygen and aspirin. But readings from the portable fetal monitor, a rare device in the emergency kit, signaled trouble. The baby's heart rate was rising, a sign of uterine distress. The next hour passed in near paralyzing tension. Elijah never left her side, stationed like a real doctor. He monitored her vitals, checked on her frequently, and offered soft words of reassurance. He had no credentials, but he had something few people do: calm in the midst of chaos. "My grandma used to say, 'Panic is an oxygen thief,'" Elijah said gently, still watching the monitor. "So we stay calm. You, me, and the baby too." Catherine gave a slight nod, her eyes still brimming. But the fear no longer consumed her. Not with this unexpected anchor beside her, this young man no one would have chosen, now holding her world together. Richard stood nearby, silent, his emotions tangled, gratitude that someone knew what to do, laced with the sting of a private reckoning, that his own prejudice, his own assumptions about appearance and value, had nearly cost his wife and child their lives. And in realizing that, he felt the overwhelming urge to collapse under the weight of his shame. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the emotion he could no longer hold back. Elijah Williams, sir." "Thank you, Elijah," Richard said, though the words felt impossibly small for the weight they were meant to carry. "Don't thank me yet, sir," Elijah replied softly, his eyes still locked on Catherine. "She needs a real doctor. So does the baby." He paused for a moment, then added, "I was supposed to have my interview tomorrow morning for the International Medical Scholars Program in London, but I guess that's not happening anymore." Richard flinched, not from surprise, but from a dawning awareness. In that moment he realized this teenager wasn't just saving his family, he was giving up a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The kind of opportunity Richard had once sacrificed everything for in his youth. Before he could respond, the plane began its descent. The seatbelt signs lit up. Gloria and another flight attendant returned to first class to prepare for landing. The entire crew focused on one goal: keeping Catherine and her unborn baby stable until professionals could take over. The plane touched down on the icy tarmac in Iceland. Harsh, white floodlights from the runway spilled into the cabin. Cold and unforgiving, but also full of promise. No one knew what the next 24 hours would bring. But one thing was certain. In the waiting room of Reykjavik International University Hospital, beneath pale fluorescent lights, all those things that once marked difference, status, wealth, had completely vanished. Between two men, a billionaire and a teenage student, only two things remained: gratitude and a respect born not from money, but from heart. They sat silently on identical plastic chairs in a sterile waiting room, both stripped of any trace of the world they came from just hours ago. Between them sat a paper cup of vending machine coffee, cold in Richard Harrington's carefully cupped hands, hands that once held only hand-brewed Arabica. Now he couldn't taste it and didn't care what brand it was. Catherine had been rushed to the emergency room immediately after landing. A team of doctors confirmed Elijah's preliminary diagnosis: pregnancy, pulmonary embolism, a high-risk medical event. But thanks to his timely intervention, her life had been spared. Without the oxygen and aspirin at that moment, things would have gone much worse, the lead doctor explained in fluent English, laced with a soft Nordic accent. "She's on anticoagulants now and being monitored closely. The fetal heart rate has stabilized, though it's still early to say she's in the clear." Now, in that vague space between worry and hope, Richard looked over at the young man sitting a few seats away. Elijah was hunched over, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Under the harsh hospital lights, he looked even younger than he had on the plane, barely more than a child. The sparse stubble on Elijah's chin did little to disguise his youth, but his eyes and the calm in his voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through more worry than most people twice his age. Richard broke the long silence. "You should get some rest. There's nothing more we can do tonight." Elijah looked up, dark circles under his eyes, but his voice remained steady. "I'm okay, sir. I'd rather wait, make sure she's going to be all right." Richard nodded, his throat suddenly tight. This boy had no connection to Catherine, no obligation to her, and yet here he was, at 2 a.m. in a foreign country, sitting quietly, steadfastly, as if he belonged nowhere else. "Tell me about the program you were headed to in London," Richard said, his voice lower now, almost as if offering a quiet atonement. Elijah sat up straighter, a flicker of light igniting in his eyes. "Medical achievers. It's an international program for high school students who want to go into medicine. They only select 50 students a year from around the world." His voice trailed off slightly, but it held quiet pride. This morning was the interview. "So that means—" Richard stopped, as if afraid to finish the sentence. "Yes." "I missed it," Elijah said with a soft smile, trying to seem unfazed. But it's okay. Some things are more important. My grandma would have said the same. A long pause followed. Richard stared down at the now cold cup of coffee in his hands. The words from the plane echoed in his mind. I take care of my grandma. She needs me. He gently turned the plastic cup between his fingers, then looked up. You say you've been taking care of her for 3 years? Yes, sir, since my mom passed away. Grandma has COPD, heart failure, and now arthritis is getting worse. It's just the two of us. Elijah didn't speak with self-pity. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was simply stating facts, like a doctor reciting a patient report. Clear, exact. Without drama, Richard sat still. The beliefs he'd held for so long, about backgrounds, about worth, about who deserved trust, began to shift. In front of him wasn't just a kid in a worn hoodie from the back of the plane. He was a young man who had quietly carried the weight of his entire family, and tonight had carried the lives of Richard's wife and unborn child, too. Elijah wasn't just a teenager, even if he was only 17. He had lived like a man, not because he chose to, but because life had left him no choice. And his knowledge of medicine, Richard now understood, didn't come from school books. It came from necessity. I had to learn fast, Elijah said, voice steady. Where I live, good health care isn't easy to find. When my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, I started reading everything I could. After she passed, I didn't stop. He gave a small, distant smile. My grandma always says, "You've got a gift, baby." Then he added slowly, "She still tries to do seamstress work, even with the arthritis, just so I can keep studying. That program in London, it was my only shot. Full scholarships for the top 10 students." His words were steady. No tears, no complaints, no plea for pity. And that, more than anything, made Richard's throat tighten. A teenager who had lost his mother, cared for his grandmother, and taught himself medicine with old materials, sat here not asking for help, but giving it, saving others. Richard finally spoke, his voice low. "I wasn't fair to you." Even he seemed surprised by his own admission. On the plane, I saw what I'd been taught to be wary of, not what I should have trusted. Elijah nodded slightly, without resentment. "I know what you saw, sir. Most people do. I'm used to it." That simple statement, no anger, no bitterness, cut into Richard like a quiet blade. A silent accusation he couldn't deny. Before he could say more, a doctor appeared at the waiting room door. "Mr. Harrington, your wife is asking for you," and he glanced at his clipboard. She'd also like to see Elijah. Said he's the young man who saved her life. Both men rose immediately, following the doctor down the long, sterile corridor, bright with fluorescent lights. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear anymore, but from something else entirely. Admiration. Catherine had been moved into a private room, the steady beeping of heart and vitals monitors filling the air like a soft mechanical lullaby. She was still pale, but no longer cyanotic. Her breathing had stabilized, and her eyes lit up when she saw them enter. "There's my hero," she whispered, lips curling into a faint smile. "Ibay told me, Elijah, that it was you who figured out what was happening while everyone else was still scrambling. You saved both of us, me and the baby." Elijah blushed, lowering his head. "Anyone with some medical knowledge would have done the same, ma'am." "But no one had that knowledge," Catherine replied gently. "Only you." She extended her hand. Elijah hesitated for a second, then stepped forward and took it. Her hand was soft, cold, but full of emotion. The doctor said, "If no one had acted in time on the plane, the baby and I might not—" She didn't finish. Her other hand moved to her belly, where a tiny heartbeat still pulsed on. Richard leaned down and kissed her forehead, his eyes brimming with tears. "How are you feeling?" "Much better. They say the medication is breaking up the clot, and the baby's heart rate is back to normal." She gave Elijah's hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Richard told me. You missed your medical interview because of us." Elijah dipped his head slightly, avoiding her gaze. His shoulders gave a small shrug, as if to say it's fine. But both adults in the room could see it wasn't easy. That scholarship, it's not that important. His voice was soft, but Catherine gently shook her head against the hospital pillow. No, Elijah, it is important. Richard said that program could open your entire future. You came all the way to London for it, didn't you? There'll be other chances, ma'am. Elijah smiled faintly, but Richard noticed the way his jaw clenched, a small but telling sign of disappointment held tightly beneath the surface. Richard watched their exchange, and in that moment something within him clarified. There was no more hesitation. You should rest now, he said softly to Catherine. The doctors said you'll need to stay at least 2 more days for observation. I booked a hotel nearby for us. He turned to Elijah. You too. The airline arranged accommodations for passengers, but I made sure you've got your own room. Get some rest. Thank you, sir. Elijah nodded, unusually formal for a boy who had just helped save his wife. I need to call my grandma. She'll be worried if she doesn't hear I made it to London. He stepped out quietly, pulling his phone from his pocket. Richard remained by his wife's bedside, eyes following the young man as he disappeared through the door. A strange feeling welled in him, not business instinct, but something softer, rarer, remorse. In just a few hours, the worldview Richard had built on financial logic and calculated certainty had been completely overturned. A boy from a world Richard had never once considered had forced him to reevaluate everything. Is special, Catherine whispered, almost reading his mind. So young and yet so strong. I keep thinking, if he hadn't been on that flight. She didn't finish, but they both knew exactly how that sentence ended. Richard tightened his hold on her hand. Get some sleep, I'm right here. As Catherine slowly drifted off, Richard remained seated, his thoughts drifting into the sterile hush of the hospital room. He thought about the kind of debt he now carried. Not the kind he'd mastered his entire life, but a moral one. One that couldn't be paid in money. Outside in the hallway, Elijah leaned against the wall, phone pressed to his ear. On the other end came Beatrice's trembling voice. You did the right thing, baby, her voice laced with the hiss of her oxygen machine. I always said, knowledge is a gift made to be shared, not hoarded. I know, Grandma, Elijah answered, his throat tight. He didn't tell her the program had declined his request to reschedule the interview. He didn't mention that the scholarship opportunity was now gone, and with the age limit of 18, this had been his only shot. He only shared the good, that he'd saved a life, that things were going to be okay. Because she had already carried enough, and he didn't want to add to her burdens. I'll be home soon, Grandma. He ended the call and drew in a deep breath. When he looked up, he saw Richard Harrington standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets. Gone was the steely gaze of a man who had once commanded a financial empire. In its place stood a man thinking deeply. They looked at each other, a black teenager from Harlem and a white billionaire who had spent most of his life seeing the world through the lens of bias. Between them lay a chasm of status, of experience, of generation. But in that moment there were no boundaries. Neither of them, not the boy who hadn't yet turned 18, nor one of the most powerful men on Wall Street, could have predicted that just one day later they would sit across from each other in a conversation that might change both of their lives, and that a request about to be spoken would bring Richard Harrington to tears, not out of conventional emotion, but because it struck the deepest, most hidden part of him, the place where he had never dared face the biases he had unknowingly nurtured. The next morning in Reykjavik, a pale sun rose through the cold wind, not strong enough to chase away the chill, but bright enough to dapple the ground in patchy light. Inside the hospital, Richard had yet to leave his wife's room. He had barely slept all night, catching brief moments of rest on the stiff chair beside Catherine's bed, his eyes constantly fixed on the heart rate and oxygen monitors. The good news, Catherine's condition had improved significantly. The doctors were optimistic. The blood clot was dissolving with medication. The baby showed no more signs of distress. But none of that, as critical as it was, occupied Richard's mind at the moment. "You look awful," Catherine said with a half-smile, glancing at him over an untouched breakfast tray. "Go back to the hotel, get cleaned up, eat something that didn't come from a vending machine. I don't want to leave you right now." "I'm okay," she said, placing a hand on her stomach. "We're both okay. But you need to recharge, and," her voice softened, "find Elijah before he leaves. I want to do something for him, something real. He saved both of us." Richard nodded, kissed her forehead gently, and stepped out. The hospital hallway was busier now, filled with Icelandic voices and the occasional English from travelers getting treatment after delayed flights. Outside, the cold air jolted him awake. His phone buzzed with backlog notifications, messages from his London office cancelling the Humanitarian of the Year award ceremony, updates about Catherine, rescheduled meetings. All of it felt like a wave from his former world crashing back in. But Richard no longer felt like he belonged to it. The past 24 hours had placed him in a different universe, one where value was measured not in assets but in humanity. The hotel arranged by the airline for displaced passengers was a simple, clean, functional building, nothing luxurious. And perhaps for the first time, such modesty felt exactly right. As he stepped into the small lobby, Richard immediately spotted Elijah sitting alone in the corner of the cafe, hunched over a notebook, his old hoodie draped over his shoulders. When Richard approached, Elijah looked up and quickly closed what appeared to be a personal journal. "Mr. Harrington, how's Mrs. Harrington this morning?" "Much better, thanks to you," Richard smiled, motioning to the seat across. "May I?" "Of course, sir." Elijah straightened up, maintaining his usual politeness, though there was a faint wariness in his eyes, a reflex born from experience. Richard signaled for coffee, then turned to fully face the teenager across from him. For the first time, he didn't see a poor kid from Harlem. He simply saw a person worth listening to. The Reykjavik morning light streamed softly through the hotel cafe windows, highlighting Elijah's tired but composed face above a half-finished cup of cold coffee. Now that the crisis had passed, Richard could truly take in the young man sitting before him. His clothes weren't new, but they were clean and neat. His posture was upright. Despite the fatigue on his face, he radiated an unusual calm, a quiet dignity. He carried himself with a quiet presence that reminded Richard of his own father, a man who once worked janitorial shifts by day and studied college courses by night, whose callous hands had laid the foundation of what would become the Harrington financial empire. "The airline's arranging return flights for everyone," Richard said, breaking the silence. "They said we'll get final details later today." "I checked," Elijah nodded. "There's one tomorrow morning to New York." "Good." Richard paused as the waitress set down 2 mugs of coffee. He used the brief moment to collect his thoughts, then looked up. "Elijah, I want to talk seriously about repayment." The word repayment had barely left his lips when the atmosphere between them shifted. Elijah's expression changed instantly, his eyes dimmed, as though a quiet curtain had dropped. Richard sensed the misstep right away. "I didn't mean it like that," he corrected quickly, sincerely. "Not money, I mean—" "I don't need anything, Mr. Harrington," Elijah replied, voice calm but distant. "I did the right thing. Anyone should do the same." "But not everyone does," Richard said softly, "and doing the right thing cost you an extraordinary opportunity." Elijah stayed quiet, his fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup. After a pause, he finally spoke, echoing a truth passed down like a lullaby. "My grandma always said, chances come and go, but doing what's right, that's something you never bargain with." Those simple words echoed in Richard's mind, striking something deep, a place he hadn't visited in years, not since he was a boy in a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, listening to his father speak similar truths. "Your grandmother sounds like an incredible woman," he said thoughtfully. "I'd love to meet her someday." Elijah was slightly surprised, but then smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "I think she'd like you. She always tells me I should meet more people, see more of the world. Is that why you applied for the program in London?" "Partly, but mostly because med school is expensive, Elijah said frankly. We can't afford it. That honest answer, unfiltered, without pretense, hit Richard with a clarity that felt like cleansing rain after years in the smog of finance. In that moment, he made a decision. I want to help you, Elijah, not as a handout, but as recognition. Richard leaned in. Recognition of who you are, what you're capable of, and the extraordinary doctor you're going to be. For the first time during their entire conversation, Elia's expression shifted. A flicker of hope crossed his face, quickly tempered by a familiar instinct for caution. That's generous, Mr. Harrington, but let me finish, Richard interrupted gently, his eyes alive with the same sharp focus he brought to billion-dollar deals. I have connections at top medical schools, and I have the means to make sure you never have to worry about affording your education. Think of it as an investment in a promising future in medicine. That's what I do. I invest in worthy futures. Elijah looked at him, not as a stranger now, but as two people standing at a meaningful crossroads. The cafe fell quiet, as if the air itself were holding its breath. He sat in thoughtful silence, fingers gently tightening around the edge of the business card, as though weighing more than just an offer, weighing an entire future. Pride clashed with practicality, dignity against the opportunity of a lifetime. Take your time, Richard said, his voice softer. Talk to your grandmother. This isn't charity. This is acknowledgement, a reward for the brilliance and perseverance you've built over all these years. He slid the business card across the table, a small piece of paper heavy with meaning. On the back, in careful handwriting, was Richard's private number. Whatever you decide, I'd still like to hear from you. Elijah took the card, stared at it a moment, then tucked it into his pocket. Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I'll think about it. He hesitated, then added, this time more seriously. But there's something I'd like to ask. Not for me, for my grandma. Richard raised an eyebrow. What does Shane need? Better health care, Elijah replied, calm, but with his hand on the table clenched into a fist. Our insurance only covers the basics. Most specialists won't take patients on Medicaid. The sentence struck Richard like a gut punch. He had half expected the boy to ask for money or help restoring the lost opportunity. But no. True to his character throughout this entire story, Elijah once again put someone else first. Of course, Richard replied almost instinctively. I can arrange everything. The best doctors, top-tier treatment, whatever she needs. It's not just money. Elijah shook his head slightly, his voice slower now, more pointed. It's the system. A system that never really works for people like my grandma. And she's not the only one in our neighborhood living like that. He began to describe, not with complaint, but with the vivid accuracy of someone who lived it. Elderly people juggling stacks of prescriptions and complicated insurance paperwork. Families forced to choose between medication and dinner. Great doctors who never stay in poor neighborhoods. And community clinics stretched too thin, understaffed, underfunded, and slowly losing hope. Richard was speechless. For years, he had donated millions to charitable foundations, funded hospitals that bore his company's name, but never had he heard a story like this, from someone who lived it, with hands that had once saved his wife's life. In that moment, the humanitarian award he had been scheduled to receive in London felt hollow. A title wrapped in gold leaf and tax deductions, not real impact. If I truly wanted to make a difference, Richard said after a long pause, not just for your grandma, but for your whole community, what do you think would actually help? Elijah looked up. For the first time that morning, surprise was clear in his eyes. Honestly, he asked, slightly hesitant. Honestly, Elijah exhaled, then answered without hesitation. A fully funded community health center, Elijah said, with good doctors who actually live in the neighborhood or at least genuinely care about it. Where patients are treated like people, not insurance codes, with transportation for the elderly and disabled, and a prescription assistance program. He gave a slight shrug, but that's big picture stuff. I don't really think. He didn't finish the sentence, but Richard wasn't focused on what came next. The wheels in his mind were already turning. "Maybe," Richard said slowly, his tone shifting to something more reflective. "Maybe that shouldn't just be a dream." He looked out the hotel window, where the soft morning light was starting to spill across the unfamiliar streets of Reykjavik. "My foundation is working on a medical center in Rwanda," he continued. "It's a major project, and I don't want you to misunderstand. It matters. But I've never considered doing something like that right in New York." "The need is real in both places," Elijah replied, calm but firm. "America's a wealthy country, but not all Americans share in that wealth." That simple truth pierced through the polished armor of Richard's awareness like a sharpened arrow. How many times had he flown over Harlem en route to JFK Airport, never once thinking about the lives unfolding beneath his jet's wings? How often had he donated to global causes, yet never lifted his head to see the cracks forming in his own city? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed in his coat pocket. A message from Catherine's doctor, asking him to return to the hospital for an urgent update. "I need to head back," Richard said, rising from his seat, his eyes still locked with the focused, sincere gaze of the teenager across from him. "But Elijah, what you said, it stayed with me. This conversation isn't over." He extended a hand. Elijah stood and shook it, a firm, deliberate handshake, like an unspoken promise. "I'll stop by the hospital later," Elijah said. "I'd like to say goodbye to Mrs. Harrington before I leave." "She'll be glad to see you," Richard replied with a warm smile before stepping out of the hotel. His mind felt sharper, clearer. The Rwanda project still mattered. It always would. But now he felt the contours of a larger void, one shaped not by geography but by proximity, the space between glass towers in the very city he called home. And when he returned to the hospital room where Catherine rested beneath the dim, golden afternoon light filtering through the window, the shape of a new plan had already taken hold. A plan not just for Elijah or his grandmother, but for an entire community. And, though he hadn't said it aloud, a plan that might change him, too. Catherine listened as Richard quietly recounted the conversation. Her eyes began to brighten. "He didn't ask for anything for himself?" she said, her voice touched with emotion. "No," Richard replied, settling onto the edge of the bed. "All he wanted was better care for his grandmother." And then he started talking about the system itself, the broken clinics, the elderly with no transport, people forced to choose between medicine and meals. Catherine tilted her head, her eyes searching his. "I think we've been playing it safe, Richard." "You're right," he nodded, gaze drifting into the distance. "We've done philanthropy, but the safe kind, the kind that earns applause. That's easy to manage." For the first time in years, Richard realized, humanitarianism wasn't just a line item on a financial report. It was presence, action, the courage to look directly at what the world had trained itself to ignore. He gently squeezed Catherine's hand, looking into her eyes. Eyes not just of the wife he had nearly lost, but of a mother imagining the world her child would inherit. "I want to do something that matters, Kath. Not for the headlines, not for strategy, for real, from the heart. Elijah made me look at everything differently." Catherine tilted her head, waiting. Richard began to outline the vision. A comprehensive community health center in the heart of Harlem. A place where people like Elijah's grandmother were cared for not based on insurance coverage, but with dignity. A place where every resident, regardless of income, race, or circumstance, had the right to be healthy. A place with committed doctors, affordable medicine, transportation for seniors, and career opportunities for local youth who dreamed of joining the medical field. And most importantly, a project he wouldn't build alone. Catherine was silent for a long moment. Then her eyes welled. For the first time since the days of fear and uncertainty, "That's beautiful, Richard. Truly. Not just for Elijah, but for me, for you, and for our baby. I want our child to grow up knowing that privilege is a gift, and that gift always comes with responsibility." A gentle knock sounded at the hospital room door. Elijah stepped in, his jacket still damp with the morning mist of Iceland. His steps were slightly hesitant, and he clutched a small, awkward bouquet in his arms. "I just wanted to bring something. My grandma always says you should never visit someone in the hospital empty-handed." "That's so thoughtful of you," Catherine said, reaching out to accept the flowers. "Thank you, Elijah. Richard told me about the conversation you two had this morning," she added, her gaze resting gently on the boy. Elijah looked slightly embarrassed. "I hope I didn't overstep." "On the contrary," Richard said, his voice warm and sincere. "You helped me open my eyes to things I've been avoiding for a long time." Elijah took the seat Richard pulled closer to the bedside. Richard didn't sit. He remained standing, as if the energy from a newfound purpose was still surging through him. "I want you to be part of this plan, Elijah, not as someone we're helping, but as a co-creator, a partner. You know what your community needs in a way we never could." Elijah looked stunned. You want me to help build it?" "Exactly," Catherine nodded. "You'll be the bridge between reality and action. Not an expert from a screen, but one whose expertise comes from the heart." Elijah's expression shifted by the minute. Confusion, gratitude, uncertainty, and finally, the flicker of a dream he'd never dared to imagine. "And this would be a paid position," Richard added with a smile. "You deserve that, Elijah. You didn't just save my wife, you saved my entire world view." Elijah sat quietly in the hospital chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if holding back a tidal wave of emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but hoarse with all he'd held in. "Why are you doing this for me? You barely know who I am." It seemed like a simple question, but in the stillness that followed, it rang with deep clarity, cutting through to something primal between three people from three very different worlds. Richard looked at Catherine, then back to Elijah, slowly, genuinely, "Because what you did on that flight wasn't just about saving a life. It was about saving a way of seeing. You noticed what everyone else ignored. You acted when it would have been easier to stay silent. And you did it not for praise or payment, just because it was the right thing to do." He paused, as though confronting an older version of himself. "I built a career in finance, partly by reading people quickly. But on that plane I got it wrong. I saw a kid in a hoodie and assumed there's nothing he can offer. That mistake almost cost me my wife and my child." Catherine reached out and gently took Elijah's hand, her gaze full of maternal warmth. "Meeting you made us reflect on everything, our values, how we've lived. This child," she said, placing a hand on her belly, "will be born into a world where privilege is a given. And we want them to understand that privilege is not a weapon to divide. It's a chance to connect, to share, to do what's right." Belitho looked down at his hands that had washed his grandmother's laundry, counted out her pills with care. Hands now being held by a woman of immense wealth, not because of power, but because of knowledge and courage. "My grandma always says God puts people in each other's paths for a reason," Elijah said with a soft smile. "She also says if a gift horse shows up, go ahead and count its teeth, but maybe she'll let this one slide." All three of them laughed, a light, easy laughter that dissolved any walls still standing. "So, is that a yes?" Richard asked, feeling for the first time in years as nervous as a young man proposing something life-changing. "Yes," Elijah nodded, his smile beginning to spread. "But I have a condition." The couple turned to him with full attention. "This can't just be about me or my grandma, or just about Harlem. The project needs people from the community involved from the beginning. Can't be the kind of charity that comes in and disappears when the spotlight fades." Richard didn't even hesitate. "Agreed. We'll build a comprehensive proposal, long-term strategy, local leadership, full transparency on every decision. And you'll be the first voice at that table." Catherine smiled, her face glowing before she winced slightly. A dull ache reminding them all how fragile what they nearly lost had been. "Tell more thing," Elijah said softly, hesitating as he turned back. "My grandma, she'll want to meet you both before I give a final answer. She's old-fashioned, the kind of person who needs to hear your voice, see your face, before giving a real yes." Catherine laughed, her eyes bright with emotion. "Of course. She's the first person we want to meet. Richard gently patted Elijah's shoulder, but his eyes no longer held the gaze of a businessman assessing a student. Instead, they reflected something far more human. Someone seeing, perhaps for the first time, what greatness really looks like. "It would be an honor," Catherine added without hesitation. Her voice was still weak, but her eyes gleamed with renewed vitality. "As soon as the doctors say I'm well enough, we'll come meet her." Richard nodded softly. But inside, a strange feeling welled up, something unfamiliar, not worry about travel or upcoming plans, but a deeply human kind of nervousness. All his life, in soundproof boardrooms and opulent conferences, Richard had never felt truly seen. Yet now, he was about to stand before a working-class woman who had raised a boy like Elijah, and he knew that if anyone could see straight through his polished exterior, down to the man beneath the billionaire's suit, it would be her. That small hospital room had somehow become the epicenter of something extraordinary, a place where the future of a forgotten neighborhood, an unborn child, and perhaps even the soul of a wealthy man, were being tethered together in a moment that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. Richard watched Elijah speak, unable to take his eyes off the boy, not because of their age difference or circumstances, but because within this teenager lived a rare blend of keen insight and instinctive compassion, something Richard had once believed no longer existed in the cutthroat world he came from. Outside the hospital window, the northern sun dipped low on the horizon. The last golden rays of the day stretched across the hospital floor, illuminating three people, seemingly unrelated, now discussing a project that would shape the future of thousands. Just before parting ways, Richard asked Elijah to step out into the hallway. "I need to say something to you," Richard began, his voice low, not as a seasoned executive, but as a man trying to make things right. "When you stepped forward on that plane, I didn't trust you. I looked at you, and I judged you." Elijah was silent for a beat, then nodded slightly, as if the words were all too familiar. "Because of how I looked, right?" he asked. There was no anger in his tone, just an acceptance of a reality he'd long grown used to. Richard nodded, his eyes unable to hide the shame. "I'm sorry. I truly am." Another pause. "My grandma always says," Elijah gave a small smile, "ignorance can be unlearned. What matters is if someone's willing to learn. I think today you're learning something big." Richard smiled, a rare smile, uncalculated, unguarded, just gratitude. He extended his hand. Elijah took it. But instead of letting go, Richard pulled the boy into a hug. Awkward, clumsy, but real. "Thank you. Not just for Catherine and the baby, but for opening my eyes." Elijah nodded, his throat tightening. And there in the quiet of the hallway, two men from opposite ends of life and the world shared something simple. "Trust." "See you tomorrow, Mr. Harrington." Richard stood still, watching as Elijah disappeared down the long corridor. Within him, the values he once thought unshakable, power, wealth, prestige, suddenly felt small, because for the first time in a long time, he sensed something much greater was just beginning. A chance to a journey, a new chapter opening not just for Elijah or Harlem, but for Richard Harrington himself, a man who once thought he had it all. 2 weeks after that near-death moment on the fateful flight, a sleek black Bentley rolled quietly through the time-worn streets of Harlem. The luxury car stood out starkly, turning heads of passers-by with a mix of curiosity and caution. This wasn't a usual sight in a neighborhood long accustomed to being overlooked by the city. Inside the car, Catherine sat beside Richard, her hands resting gently on her round belly. Now in her 3rd trimester, the medical crisis in Iceland felt like a fading memory, but the morning injections to prevent blood clots served as a daily reminder of how fragile the line between life and death could be. "Are you nervous?" Catherine asked, watching her husband closely. The man who often negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, now fiddling with his cufflinks like a schoolboy awaiting test results. "A little," Richard admitted, forcing a smile. I want to make a good impression. Catherine smiled and reached for his hand. Just be yourself. Not the CEO version of Richard Harrington, just the man I fell in love with. The car pulled up in front of an aging apartment building. A sign on the door read, "Elevator out of order. Sorry for the inconvenience." Richard looked up at the chipped facade, his mind involuntarily comparing this real estate to their sleek Manhattan penthouse. The contrast struck him harder than expected. For the first time, he fully felt the weight of privilege he had lived with all his life, without ever needing to question it. Elijah was waiting for them in the lobby. He looked more relaxed and approachable in a worn Howard University sweatshirt, his face lighting up when he saw Catherine. "Welcome to my home," he said, offering his hand to help her gently, "like family. Grandma's upstairs, and yes, she cooked lunch like we were hosting an entire football team." They climbed 5 flights of stairs. Richard insisted on carrying the 2 gift baskets despite Elijah's protests. On the 4th floor, Catherine had to pause to catch her breath. "My grandma hasn't left the apartment in 3 weeks, Elijah said softly. "The oxygen tank's too heavy, the stairs are broken, and I've been juggling school and work." Every step up the dim stairwell felt like a slap to Richard's awareness. For the first time, he saw the absurdity of a healthcare system that burdens the fragilest with physical obstacles. In his mind, the idea of a community health project expanded, no longer just a clinic, but a redesign of the living ecosystem itself. The apartment door opened before they even knocked. Beatrice Williams appeared, a small elderly woman with an oxygen tube but dressed neatly as if heading to Sunday service. A pressed floral dress, silver hair pulled back into a bun, and eyes filled with emotion. Come in," she said, her voice raspy but commanding. "I've heard a lot about you two, but I don't believe in anything until I see it with my own eyes." Richard, once dubbed the King of Wall Street by the press, suddenly felt small, like a teenager meeting his partner's family for the first time. He bowed slightly, a rare gesture of true respect. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Williams," Catherine said, and in that moment there were no class differences, no racial lines, just people connected by what once seemed like a random series of events that ended up changing their lives forever. In the soft afternoon light of a winter's day, the glossy black Bentley rolled slowly through Harlem's narrow, time-worn streets. The car's presence drew curious glances from residents used to luxury existing only on television screens. Inside, Catherine sat beside Richard, her baby bump now unmistakable as she entered her 3rd trimester. The medical emergency in Iceland felt distant now, though the daily anticoagulant injection served as a constant reminder of life's fragility. "Are you nervous?" Catherine asked, noting the unusual tension in her husband's posture. Richard Harrington, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, now fidgeted with his cufflinks like a student awaiting test results. "A little," he admitted. "I want to make a good impression," Catherine smiled, reaching for his hand. "Just be yourself, the real you, not Richard Harrington, the CEO." The car stopped in front of a modest apartment building with a handwritten sign taped across the entrance. "Elevator out of service. Sorry for the inconvenience." Richard looked up at the weathered facade, involuntarily comparing the property's value to their luxury penthouse in Manhattan. The disparity hit him harder than ever before, a stark confrontation with the privilege he'd never fully acknowledged. Elijah stood waiting by the entrance, his warm smile erasing any formality. He looked different, more grounded in his old Howard sweatshirt, probably his late mother's. "Welcome to our neighborhood," he said, offering his hand to help Catherine from the car. "Grandma's really excited to meet you both. Heads up, she cooked like she's feeding 20 people." They climbed the 5 floors to the Williams family apartment, Richard insisting on carrying the gifts despite Elijah's attempts to stop him. The reality of Elijah's daily life came into full view. This was a building with a broken elevator for months, where disabled residents like Beatrice Williams were effectively trapped without help. "Grandma hasn't been outside in nearly 3 weeks, Elijah explained as they paused for Catherine to rest on the 4th floor. "The oxygen tank's too heavy, and I've been swamped with school and shifts. Richard mentally added building accessibility upgrades to the Community Health Initiative list. What good is medical care if patients can't physically reach it? The apartment door opened before they knocked. Beatrice Williams stood with quiet authority. Though wearing an oxygen tube and attached to a portable tank, she was impeccably dressed, as if heading to church. Her floral dress crisp, silver hair tidy. "So, these are the folks from the airplane," she said to Elijah, her voice deep but sharp as she eyed the Harringtons. "Come in. Don't let the warm air escape." The apartment was small but immaculately clean, its furnishings gleaming with care. Family photos lined the walls. A young Beatrice with a woman clearly Elijah's mother, Elijah himself at different ages, from a gap-toothed kid to the young man sitting across from them now. The comforting smell of home-cooked food filled the air, cornbread, greens, and something sweet simmering on the stove. "Mrs. Williams, thank you for welcoming us into your home," Richard said respectfully, surprised by how deeply this woman's gaze could see through him. "We brought a few gifts," he added, motioning awkwardly toward the baskets. "Set them down and have a seat." Beatrice gestured to the sofa. "We'll get to the gifts later. First, I want to see the people my grandson saved." Her directness was softened by the pride in her eyes as she looked at Elijah, who was helping Catherine into the most comfortable chair. As they settled into the small living room, Beatrice studied Catherine with a sharp but caring eye. "You look better than what Elijah described on that plane. Got some color back. How's the baby?" "Healthy," Catherine replied, immediately feeling the warmth behind Beatrice's blunt tone. "Doctors say there's no lasting harm from the incident. We're beyond grateful for Elijah. If he hadn't recognized what was happening, God puts knowledge where it's needed," Beatrice said simply. "I've been telling this boy since he was knee-high that his brain was a gift meant to serve." She turned to Richard with a measured look. "Now then, Mr. Millionaire, Elijah tells me you're planning some kind of health program for the neighborhood." Richard, caught off guard by the direct address, stumbled over the speech he'd mentally prepared. "Yes, we, meaning the Harrington Foundation, are working to establish a comprehensive community health initiative, starting with this neighborhood as a pilot program. Elijah's insights helped us understand what the real needs are." Beatrice interrupted, unimpressed by the corporate jargon. "And why here? New York has a lot of poor neighborhoods. Why Harlem, and why now all of a sudden?" The question sliced through any pretense, demanding honesty. Richard looked at Elijah, who was watching the exchange with carefully measured neutrality, then to Catherine, who gave a nod of encouragement. "Because Elijah made me see things I had chosen not to see," Richard admitted, abandoning the pre-written lines. "I've lived in New York all my life, built my fortune here, and yet I behaved like places like this didn't exist, except as statistics in charity reports." The conversation continued, gradually forming concrete plans for the Harlem Community Health Initiative. Richard realized this wasn't just a philanthropic endeavor or a business model. It was an acknowledgement of shared humanity that transcended the invisible walls he hadn't realized he'd built around his life. As they prepared to leave, Richard once again thanked Beatrice for her warm welcome and candid counsel. "You've shown me a side of life I've overlooked for far too long." "Just remember," Beatrice replied, her eyes full of quiet hope, "serving a community isn't an act. It's a long-term commitment." Richard looked directly at Beatrice, his gaze no longer that of a high-powered businessman, but of a man seeking atonement. "Your grandson didn't just save my wife and child, Mrs. Williams," he said quietly. "He made me question things I'd never thought to examine." Beatrice held his gaze for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then suddenly she laughed. A deep, warm laugh that softened the tension in the small room. "Finally some truth," she said, turning to Elijah. "This man might not be as bad as the other rich folks. Maybe he really can learn something." The mood in the room lightened. Elijah smiled with a hint of relief, and so did Catherine. Richard felt like he had passed an important test, even if he didn't know what the questions were. "Now then," Beatrice continued, her tone growing serious again, "before we eat, I want to know exactly what your plans are. No company speak, Plain English. What are you doing? When? And how do you plan to make sure it doesn't vanish the moment you find something shinier to chase? Over the next hour, as they moved to the small dining table, now overflowing with enough food for twice their number, Richard outlined the emerging plan for the health initiative. Beatrice's sharp questions made the conversation more grounded and specific. Transportation for seniors and people with disabilities, upgrades to the community clinic with culturally competent staff, medication assistance programs, better access to preventive care. And how exactly do you want Elijah involved? Beatrice asked, as she served Catherine a second slice of sweet potato pie, despite her polite refusal. In whatever way he's willing, Richard answered sincerely. His perspective is invaluable. We've offered him a formal advisory role, with pay, that fits his school schedule and leads toward a full medical school scholarship. Beatrice nodded slowly. And the catch? There's always a catch. There is no catch, Mrs. Williams, Catherine said gently. What Elijah did for us can't be repaid with money. This isn't about settling a debt. It's about recognizing the ability and character of someone who might never have gotten that chance in a system that too often overlooks young men like your grandson. Beatrice looked at Catherine for a long time, then turned to Elijah. What do you think, baby? These the same people from the airplane. You trust them? Elijah, who had stayed mostly silent through the detailed exchange, thought carefully before answering. I do, Grandma. I think they're being real. He smiled faintly. And if they're not, I know you'll set them straight. That made Beatrice chuckle again. You're damn right I will, she said, then turned back to the Harringtons, her face sobering. My grandson is special, not just smart, though Lord knows his brain's been running since he was born, but kind. The kind of kind this world doesn't see much of anymore. In the soft golden glow of the autumn afternoon, the black Bentley glided through the streets of Harlem, drawing curious stares from passers-by. Inside, Catherine sat beside Richard, her baby bump prominent as she entered her third trimester. The medical emergency in Iceland now felt like a distant dream, though the daily anticoagulant injections were a constant reminder of how thin the line between life and death could be. What are you thinking? Catherine asked, noticing the unusual stillness in her husband's expression. Richard, who had calmly negotiated billion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat, now looked almost boyish in his unease. I'm thinking about how close we came to never meeting them, he said softly. If you hadn't had the clot, if Elijah hadn't been on that flight, if I hadn't listened to him, our lives would have kept running in parallel and never touched. Catherine nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. And how many more people like Elijah are out there, people we'll never meet? How many like Beatrice? The question hung between them as the car glided through the streets of Harlem toward the invisible line that separated this world from the wealthy Manhattan they called home. What Elijah asked for, Richard said after a long silence, wasn't just better medical care for his grandmother. It was the recognition of her dignity, his own potential, and the value of their community. His voice caught unexpectedly. All the things I would have completely missed if that crisis hadn't forced me to see them. Catherine squeezed his hand. Then we need to make sure this initiative reflects that understanding. Not just funding, but real partnership. Not just for Elijah and Beatrice, but for everyone they represent. As the Bentley turned onto Fifth Avenue, the contrast between Harlem's worn buildings and the opulence of the Upper East Side was stark. And yet, for perhaps the first time, Richard didn't just see the contrast, he saw the connection. The shared humanity that wealth had made him forget, and that a chance encounter at 35,000 feet had forced him to remember. 6 months later, as fall leaves turned golden across Central Park, the Harlem Community Health Initiative opened its doors inside a renovated building that had once been an abandoned community center. On the dedication plaque beneath the formal inscription acknowledging the foundation's support, there was a single quote, "God puts knowledge where it's needed." Beatrice Williams. Inside, residents didn't just find health care, they found dignity. Doctors looked like them, staff spoke their language, and the system was built to serve them, not shut them out. In a small office decorated with medical textbooks and a college acceptance letter from Columbia's pre-med program, Elijah Williams spent his after-school hours coordinating between healthcare staff and community needs. His natural leadership flourished under guidance that treated his perspective not as an exception, but as a strength. And in a private hospital room across the city, Catherine Harrington held her newborn daughter, Beatrice Elizabeth Harrington, named after two women whose strength had shaped the child's world before she ever entered it. Beside her stood Richard, joined by Elijah and Miss Beatrice, who had been brought to the hospital in the Harrington family's private vehicle to meet the baby named in her honor. "She's got strong lungs," Beatrice said as the baby's cries echoed through the room. "She's going to be a tough one, just like her godfather," Catherine added with a smile toward Elijah, who looked both honored and overwhelmed by the role they'd asked him to take, as Beatrice gently cradled the newborn with practiced hands. Despite the oxygen tube still helping her breathe, Richard stepped back to take in the scene. This unlikely family, forged through crisis and connection, bridged worlds that were never truly meant to be apart. And in that moment, as Elijah leaned in to hear something his grandmother whispered about the baby, Richard felt the full weight of the transformation that had begun on that plane. The young man who had saved his wife and child had given Richard something just as precious, a chance to redeem himself, to become the man he had always claimed to be, but had never truly been until now. What Elijah asked for in return for his heroic act wasn't money, it wasn't connections, it wasn't personal gain. It was the recognition of a shared humanity, something Richard's wealth and privilege had blinded him to for far too long. And that, more than anything, was what brought Richard to tears. Tears of shame, tears of gratitude, and finally tears of hope for a more connected world they were now building together, one relationship at a time.